It was a quiet summer evening in Berlin, June 26, 1939. On a dimly lit side street tucked away from the grand boulevards and political theatres of the capital, four men gathered for dinner. There were no cameras, no microphones, just an unremarkable table inside a forgettable restaurant, one favoured by foreign ministry officials not for its cuisine, but for the discretion it provided. Seated there were two representatives of Nazi Germany's Foreign Office, Dr. Kurt Schnurrer and Walter Schmid, across from their Soviet counterparts, Georgy Astakov and Evgeny Barbarin. On paper, it was a trade meeting. Dry negotiations, grain for machines, numbers and tonnage. But beneath the polite small talk and half-hearted bites of cold salmon, the conversation was shifting, not toward business, but toward war. For months, Europe had teetered on the brink. Hitler's fury was focused on Poland, while Britain and France had staked their reputations on a pledge to defend it. Yet behind closed doors, few believed they'd act decisively. Stalin certainly didn't. Years later, he would tell Churchill, face to face in the Kremlin, that Moscow had seen through the Western bluff. The British and French hoped the alliance alone would scare Hitler, he said, but we knew it wouldn't. Stalin had already begun to signal his true intentions back in March. In a brutal speech, he lashed out at Britain and France for appeasing Hitler at Munich and made it clear that the Soviet Union wouldn't be dragged into war to rescue their pride. Just 2 months later, he removed Maxim Litvinov, the last real advocate for Western alignment in his government. Back in Berlin, the evening dragged on. Glasses of cheap Rhine wine were topped off. Then, calmly and with rehearsed precision, Schnurrer steered the conversation away from tariffs and rail quotas. "There is no issue between our nations," he said, almost casually. "From the Baltic to the Black Sea, even as far as the Far East, that cannot be resolved." He paused, fork resting against his plate. "No issue at all." That single, calculated comment over dinner had set in motion one of the greatest acts of diplomatic deception in modern history, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. 2 months later, under the chandeliers of the Kremlin, Germany and the Soviet Union would sign what the world believed to be a simple non-aggression treaty. In truth, it was the prelude to an invasion and a partition of the country trapped between them, Poland. In the weeks that followed, Stalin still toyed with the idea of an alliance with Britain and France, yet the delegation they sent to Moscow was an insult. Mid-level officers with no authority to sign anything. The talks dragged on pointlessly, while, behind the scenes, Hitler made his own move. Berlin proposed a sweeping 25-year pact of friendship with Moscow. For both sides, the game was simple: stall, deceive, and strike when the timing was perfect. As Churchill later admitted, the Soviets had concealed their true intentions to the last possible moment. When the Western mission achieved nothing, Hitler acted directly. He cabled Stalin himself, requesting that the Soviet leader receive his foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop in Moscow immediately and with full authority to sign. What followed stunned every foreign office in Europe. The public pact pledged that both nations would desist from any act of violence or aggression against each other. But the secret protocol, hidden for decades, told a different story. Discovered only in 1945 among captured German archives and denied by Moscow until 1989, it quietly carved up Eastern Europe along 3 rivers, the Narew, the Vistula, and the San. The two powers would decide later whether Poland would continue to exist at all. In the end, they would decide it would not. For the Soviet Union, this was more than strategy, it was revenge. The Red Army had been humiliated by Poland in 1920, losing huge swaths of Ukrainian and Belarusian territory. Stalin had been the political commissar in that war. His reputation suffered for it, and his commander at the time, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, paid the price. Years later, Stalin had him arrested, tortured, and shot, a personal reckoning disguised as state security. Now, in the late summer of 1939, the chance for payback had come. A week after the pact was signed, Hitler began the territorial and political arrangement promised in the document. German forces assembled along Poland's western frontier, engines idling in the dawn mist. Ribbentrop, still in Berlin, sent a message to Stalin's foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov. He asked bluntly, would the Soviet Union object if the Wehrmacht pursued retreating Polish forces across the boundary marked for the Soviet sphere? And he added, would it not be preferable for Soviet troops to enter their sector at once? Molotov's reply came the next day, brief and cold. We agree, he said, that at a suitable time, concrete action will be absolutely necessary, but that time has not yet come. The meaning was clear. The Soviets would wait, watching as the German army crushed Polish resistance, just as they would do again 5 years later at Warsaw. By early September, the German campaign in Poland was moving faster than even Hitler had anticipated. On the 8th, with Polish formations collapsing under blitzkrieg pressure, Ribbentrop once again reached out to Moscow. The message was blunt. The Polish army was, in his words, more or less in a state of dissolution. Would the Soviets now move? Molotov responded cautiously. Soviet intervention, he said, would come within the next few days. But behind the scenes, Red Army units were already massing along Poland's eastern frontier. And at the Kremlin, Stalin's advisors worked to manufacture a legal and political excuse for invading a country they had signed a non-aggression pact with back in 1932, a treaty that technically remained valid for another 6 years. Molotov eventually delivered the cover story. The Polish state, he claimed, was collapsing. Law and order had disintegrated. Entire regions were leaderless. Therefore, the Soviet Union would intervene, not as a conqueror, but as a protector, to defend the Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities stranded inside eastern Poland. As Molotov later admitted to the Germans, the aim was to create the illusion of humanitarian action, to make Soviet intervention appear plausible to the masses, while carefully avoiding any perception of aggression. On September 14th, Pravda ran its first signals. A carefully worded piece referenced the danger to eastern peoples as German lines moved deeper into the Polish heartland. At the same time, German units had already overstepped the agreed demarcation boundary between the two powers. Meanwhile, Berlin falsely announced that Warsaw had already fallen, putting Stalin under pressure to move. Now it was the Soviets' turn, Churchill later wrote. And so, on September 16th at 6 p.m., the German ambassador met Molotov again. Molotov stated plainly, Soviet military intervention was now imminent, perhaps tomorrow or the day after. 12 hours later, at 5:20 a.m. on September 17th, Moscow quietly informed Berlin the Red Army would cross the border that morning. But even in invasion, the Soviets clung to formalities. Before their tanks rolled, they summoned the Polish ambassador, Wacław Grzybowski, to the foreign ministry in Moscow. Deputy Commissar Vladimir Potemkin handed him a sealed diplomatic note. Grzybowski demanded to know what was inside. Potemkin, unmoved, read it aloud. The Polish-German war has revealed the internal bankruptcy of the Polish state. In 10 days of military operations, Poland has lost all her industrial areas and cultural centers. Warsaw no longer exists as the capital of Poland. The Polish government has disintegrated. It no longer shows any signs of life. This means the Polish state and its government have ceased to exist. Therefore, any agreements concluded between the USSR and Poland have lost their validity. No declaration of war, no warning, just a line in the sand, crossed without a single shot fired diplomatically. At that very moment, tens of thousands of Soviet troops were already moving westward. The note handed to Ambassador Grzybowski was dressed in the language of protection, but its meaning was unmistakable, an ultimatum masked as mercy. Left without leadership, it read, Poland has become a field for hazards and contingencies, posing a potential threat to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, it claimed, had until now remained neutral, but could do so no longer. The note continued. The Soviet government cannot remain indifferent to the fate of its kindred peoples, Ukrainians and Belarusians, living on Polish territory. They have been left to the mercy of fate, defenseless. Therefore, the Red Army has been ordered to cross the frontier to take the lives and property of Western Ukraine and Western Belarusia under protection. At the same time, the Soviet government will take all measures to extricate the Polish people from the unfortunate war into which they were dragged by unwise leaders and allow them to live a peaceful life. Grzybowski exploded. Poland will never cease to exist, he snapped, throwing the note back onto the table. What followed was almost farcical, a shoving match of paperwork, with the document pushed back and forth for over 10 minutes. Grzybowski stormed out of the meeting, refusing to acknowledge the letter as legitimate, but the Soviets had no intention of letting him ignore it. Later that day, a uniformed messenger appeared at the Polish embassy, envelope in hand. Grzybowski sent him away. The next morning, the same message arrived by regular post. Then came the final insult. The Soviets declared that with Poland no longer existing as a sovereign state, the ambassador's diplomatic immunity was void. Grzybowski was arrested. Only the quiet intervention of the German ambassador, an aging aristocrat who, unlike many in Berlin, still retained a sense of personal shame, secured his release. Others weren't so lucky. The Polish consul in Kiev was arrested around the same time. He simply vanished. No trial, no record, no return. And with the paper formalities now complete, Moscow made its next move, not through letters, but through steel. At 5 a.m. on September 17th, 20 minutes ahead of Stalin's original schedule, the Soviet invasion of Poland began. It came without fanfare, no declarations, no warnings. Dead silence fell, one Polish general later recalled. At a forward outpost, a Soviet spearhead appeared through the morning haze. A platoon commander gathered his men. A soldier who survived later described what happened next. He told us the Red Army had crossed the frontier, that the situation was hopeless. There was no chance of victory. He said we could lay down our weapons. Then he asked, "Who wishes to fight for the honor of the Polish army? Step to the right." We all stepped to the right. Nearly 500,000 Soviet troops swept across the border, supported by 4,700 armored vehicles and close to 2,000 aircraft. Yet despite their overwhelming numbers, the assault was chaotic. Communications were disjointed, supply lines stumbled, and across the 900-mile front, reports filtered in slowly. In one case, a Polish border officer phoned headquarters to ask for orders. The reply he got was absurd. He was told to send an envoy to determine Soviet intentions. The officer's response was brief. "All my battalions are already fighting. 2 Soviet tanks have been destroyed. I doubt I'll be able to dispatch any envoy. Air raid underway. I must go." Compared to the German blitzkrieg, the Red Army moved like a disorganized tide. Polish eyewitnesses described the contrast in jarring terms. "This was Asia. Asia has invaded us," one Polish officer wrote in his diary. A young girl in eastern Poland remembered watching the Soviet columns arrive in her town. They looked tired. Their coats were torn, their faces grey and rough. They were dirty, harsh. All they wanted was to buy watches, any kind, as long as it ticked. Despite the disorder, the Red Army kept advancing, slowly but unstoppably, divided into 2 massive fronts, pushing around the Pripet marshes. In the north, the Byelorussian front, under General Mikhail Kovalev, aimed for Grodno and Vilnius. In the south, General Semyon Timoshenko's Ukrainian front surged toward Lwów. Riding alongside Timoshenko was Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's loyal fixer in the Ukraine. His wife, Nina, joined the convoy, quietly searching for her parents, who had been stranded in Poland since the end of the last war in 1921. On paper, the Red Army was a force of overwhelming strength. In practice, it struggled. More tanks were lost to mechanical failure than to enemy fire. Aircraft crashed or went missing. Coordination between units was poor, but it barely mattered. The only resistance the Soviets encountered came from the 12,000-strong Border Protection Corps, the KOP, and scattered, retreating Polish units already battered by German airstrikes and armor. There was no high command left to unify them, no air support, no supply lines, just fragments of an army trying to survive the collapse. "Germany has killed the prey," wrote the New York Times at the time, and Soviet Russia now seizes the carcass Germany cannot use. It plays the ignoble role of hyena to the German lion. The Soviet invasion broke what little resistance remained. With their eastern border now collapsing behind them, many Polish soldiers gave up any illusion of turning the tide against the Germans. That same afternoon, September 17th, Poland's high command and government abandoned the country entirely, fleeing south across the Romanian frontier. By 4 p.m., the Polish commander-in-chief issued his final order. I hereby order a total withdrawal to Romania and Hungary via the shortest possible route. Do not fight the Bolsheviks unless they attack or attempt to disarm our forces. It was a silent admission of defeat, a military collapse without formal surrender. For the exhausted and disoriented remnants of the Polish army, it meant fragmentation. Some followed the order and marched toward internment. Others, too isolated to receive it, kept fighting. But there were also those who simply refused to run. One such unit, part of the Border Protection Corps, counted just 50 men, surrounded, outgunned, and alone. Still, they held their position against an entire Soviet division. For 4 days they fought from dugouts and forest bunkers, inflicting dozens of casualties. When their ammunition ran dry, Soviet flamethrower teams advanced. One survivor later wrote, "We heard the fuel tanks hiss before they fired. Then the bunkers lit up like oil barrels. There was no screaming, just fire." Another detachment farther south ambushed a Soviet column and killed over 200 Red Army soldiers before being overrun. In a third engagement, Polish defenders fought until half their number lay dead, refusing to fall back. For these men, there was no thought of retreat. One officer wrote in his diary, "It is better to vanish as soldiers than survive as prisoners." Soviet forces did not always fight openly. In several sectors, they approached while waving white flags, loudspeakers blasting Polish patriotic songs. Commanders shouted across no man's land, "Don't shoot! We've come to help you, to fight the Germans." Some Polish troops hesitated. The deception worked. Confused Soviet infantry, many poorly briefed conscripts, seemed to believe it themselves. One captured Red Army private from Smolensk told his interrogators, "They said we were protecting Ukraine from Hitler. They never said we were invading." In one instance, Polish officers were invited to a fraternal reception. Dressed in their finest uniforms, they arrived unarmed, only to be surrounded and arrested at gunpoint. But many Soviet units made no attempt at diplomacy. In one village near the Bug River, tanks rolled through the streets without warning and opened fire. They shot at everything that moved, a local shopkeeper remembered. The panic was indescribable. People ran in every direction, some barefoot, screaming. I saw a small boy, maybe 6 or 7, standing frozen in the street. A tank gunned him down like a scarecrow. No one even stopped. Such scenes repeated in dozens of towns, not as part of official orders, but from confusion, panic, or indifference. The effect was the same. In the north, resistance ignited in the cities of Vilna and Grodno. Vilna was held by 7,000 Polish troops, mostly reservists, supported by just 15 artillery pieces and a few dozen machine guns. Still, they chose to fight. One man from the 6th Legion's infantry regiment later recalled the opening moments. The tanks came first, then the infantry behind them, shouting, "Hurrah! For Stalin! For the motherland!" I will never forget those cries echoing off the buildings, but we caught them with flanking fire, short bursts, then fall back. Another soldier watched the attack unfold from a window above the main road. They kept coming. One would fall, another would rise, another after him. We ran out of belts and had to load the machine guns by hand. By the evening, we had set fire to 3 tanks with petrol bombs. The street burned like a trench line. On September 19th, after 24 hours of intense combat, Polish forces broke out. They retreated 12 miles through woods and farmland to reach neutral Lithuania. They carried their wounded on stretchers made of door frames and their dead in silence. In Grodno, 75 miles southwest, the situation was even more dire. The defenders had just 2,000 soldiers, a few civilian volunteers, 2 anti-aircraft guns, and a dozen light machine guns. Soviet tanks rolled into the outskirts at dawn on September 20th. Polish gunners targeted the tracks with AA fire, disabling several. Infantry squads rushed forward with Molotov cocktails, gasoline in glass bottles packed with cloth fuses. "They fought as long as they had bullets in their pouches," wrote a local school teacher. "As long as grenades hung from their belts, as long as the machine guns they'd hauled to the barricades kept firing. When the guns stopped, they threw bricks. When the bricks ran out, they screamed." Street by street, the defenders were pushed back, but they made the Soviets fight for every inch. In the final hours of the battle for Grodno, the Soviets began using civilians as shields. Polish Boy Scouts, barely teenagers, had been volunteering as ammunition runners and message couriers through the chaos of the city streets. When captured, some were tied to the front of Soviet tanks, bound with ropes and lashed across the armor, used as human shields in the assault. Resistance collapsed soon after. Grodno fell the next day. The last defenders either surrendered or were buried beneath rubble. Further south, another defining scene was taking shape. On the outskirts of Brest-Litovsk, a Soviet armored car encountered elements of Germany's 10th Panzer Division. It was the first formal contact between German and Soviet forces in the Polish campaign. The symbolism was not lost on Western observers. Winston Churchill later wrote, "Here in the previous war, the Bolsheviks, in breach of their solemn obligations to the Western Allies, had made their separate peace with the Kaiser's Germany and bowed to its harsh terms. Now, in Brest-Litovsk, it was with Hitler's Germany that the Russian communists grinned and shook hands." Doing the handshaking for Germany was General Heinz Guderian, and by all accounts, he was furious about it. His forces had just spent 2 days capturing Brest-Litovsk from determined Polish defenders. Then, Berlin informed him that according to the secret Soviet-German protocol, the city was to be handed over to the Red Army. The order came down with no room for debate. Guderian complied, but not without quiet contempt. At the official handover on September 22nd, he stood stiffly atop a makeshift wooden platform, reviewing the assembled Soviet troops. Red Army Brigadier General Semyon Krivoshein, sent to represent Moscow, stood opposite him. Guderian, immaculate in his field grey uniform, watched the parade through narrowed eyes. Soviet soldiers passed by in worn boots, torn coats, and ill-fitting gear. Later, Guderian wrote that he found their condition astonishing compared to his own well-equipped men. The contrast wasn't just visual, it was ideological. 2 armies, 2 worlds, shaking hands over a corpse. While Brest-Litovsk passed quietly into Soviet hands, the Ukrainian front moved at pace. Timoshenko, commanding the southern Soviet thrust, ordered his armies to reach the Kowal-Włodzimierz-Wolyński-Sokal line within 3 days, and from there pushed toward the San River. His forces met the timetable without resistance, advancing more than 60 miles on the first day alone. Traveling near the front lines were Timoshenko himself and Nikita Khrushchev. Years later, Khrushchev recalled the speed and danger of their movements. "When we crossed the border, we encountered no resistance. Our troops reached Ternopil quickly. Timoshenko and I passed through the city, but returned along a different road, which, looking back, wasn't smart. There were still Polish units in the area, and anything could have happened. Some villages were Ukrainian, others Polish, but we were driving through places where no Soviet troops had yet arrived. It could have gone badly. When we rejoined our forces, Stalin was already asking for us by phone. We reported that the operation was progressing well." For many Ukrainians, unaware of what Stalin's regime had already done to their people just a few years earlier, the Red Army's arrival looked like liberation. In the 1930s, millions had died in the Holodomor, a man-made famine engineered by Moscow. But Soviet propaganda had wiped the memory clean. Now, as tanks rolled down village roads, civilians lined the streets with flowers. One Red Army general recalled, "Women and girls began handing out flowers. At first just a few, but then more, waving, smiling. From every window came cries, 'Long live the Red Army! Long live the Soviet Union!' It echoed down the roads." What went unspoken was how these celebrations were often followed by darker acts. In some areas, jubilant mobs turned against Polish neighbors. Homes were burned. Men were dragged out and shot in the streets. Not all of it was spontaneous. By September 21st, Soviet forces reached the outskirts of Lwów, a key Polish city already under siege by the Germans. A Polish colonel was sent out under a flag of truce to meet the incoming Soviet units. He asked their commander bluntly, "Why have you come?" The reply was delivered without hesitation. "You must have read the newspapers." There was nothing more to say. When the Polish envoy replied that newspapers hadn't reached the city in days, the Soviet officer pressed the farce further. "Then perhaps you have heard on the radio what has taken place." The Pole shook his head. The Germans had cut the power. The radios were dead. He tried again. "So why are you here?" The Soviet commander smiled thinly and repeated the lie, that the Red Army had come to fight the Germans. The Pole, realizing any argument was pointless, pretended to accept it. He unfolded a map on the table, pointing out supposed German positions and suggesting routes of attack. The Soviet officer nodded politely, then insisted his troops needed to enter the city to establish observation points for artillery. "Something strange is happening," the Polish officer later reflected. "But one thing is certain. Both enemies want to break into the city." By the following afternoon, after consulting his remaining staff, the Polish commander in Lwów accepted the inevitable. With the Germans on one side and the Soviets on the other, continued resistance meant annihilation. At 3 p.m. on September 22nd, the city surrendered to General Timoshenko and Commissar Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev's wife Nina was also in the city, and at last she found her parents, lost since 1921, when Poland's border had swallowed their village. Her relief was genuine. Khrushchev's was tempered by anger. He scolded her for carrying a pistol in her luggage, snapping that she could have been shot if discovered. For a moment, war paused for domestic irritation. After the surrender, Khrushchev met with captured Polish officers. He offered reassurance in a calm, almost paternal tone. "Russia always keeps her obligations," he told them. "You will be treated properly." But the Poles soon learned what those words were worth. General Władysław Anders, commander of the Polish Cavalry Corps, had been trying to lead his men south toward the Romanian border. 12 miles short of safety, Soviet armor encircled him. After a brief, hopeless fight, he surrendered. His fate was not execution, but something slower. He was sent to Moscow, where his world reduced to a filthy cell crawling with rats and bedbugs. He endured weeks of interrogations, beatings, dysentery, scurvy, and finally solitary confinement inside the Lubyanka. He was one of the lucky ones. He lived. Elsewhere, Soviet reprisals were immediate and methodical. After Grodno's fall, 29 Polish officers were led from their cells, marched beyond the town, and shot beside a ditch. Their commander, Brigadier General Józef Olszyna Wilczynski, was captured while fleeing by car. He was pulled out onto the roadside and executed without trial. The next day, Soviet officers summoned his widow and presented her with his blood-stained briefcase, calling it an act of courtesy. A surrendering Polish brigade met a similar fate. Roughly 100 officers and non-commissioned men were separated from their troops and marched away under guard. Moments later, the soldiers heard the rattle of gunfire. "We asked the Soviet officers if another Polish detachment was still fighting," one survivor later recalled. "They said, 'Those were your masters, shot dead.'" That line, cold, bureaucratic, final, marked the true character of the Soviet invasion. Deception had given way to purging. The masks of liberation were gone. What began with promises of protection now dissolved into silence, gunfire, and unmarked graves. Routed and encircled, the last Polish formations continued to fall. Roughly 2,000 Polish soldiers were captured 90 miles south of Lublin as Soviet columns sealed the last escape routes. The Polish 7th, 39th and 41st regiments had been trying to regroup, but were surrounded and forced to surrender the following day. In one final act of defiance, a cavalry detachment, nearly 1,500 strong, mounted up and charged Soviet tanks in an attempt to break the encirclement. It was a hopeless gesture, but not a suicidal one. They used terrain, fog, and speed, and hit hard. One officer remembered hearing the clatter of hooves and the thunder of gunfire blending together in the grey. By the end, 140 were dead. The rest laid down their arms. In one of the rare tactical victories against the Soviets, General Wilhelm Orlik Ruckmann led his scattered command to the village of Szak on September 28th. There, his troops, down to barely 3,000 men, ambushed elements of the Soviet 52nd Rifle Division. 8 T-26 tanks were destroyed by Polish Bofors anti-tank guns, and brutal hand-to-hand combat broke out along the tree line. "We fought with bayonets, spades, rifle butts," one Polish corporal recalled. "There was no more retreat. They came through the woods in waves. We held until our rifles jammed from dirt. More than 300 Soviets were killed before the line broke." 2 days later, Orlik Ruckermann's battered force made a final stand at Vytishno, 18 miles west of the Bug River. The fighting lasted 8 hours. Soviet artillery shelled the tree line until the barrels glowed red. By dusk, the Poles had just 60 artillery shells left. The men, too exhausted to carry out the counterattack their general had ordered, lay on the ground, silent, watching the horizon for another wave. That night, knowing what morning would bring, Orlik Ruckermann gave the order to break out and disperse. He escaped across the border into Lithuania. His wounded did not. Soviet troops dumped them into the town hall and left them to die, bleeding out on stone floors, calling for help that never came. Back in Moscow, the final stage of Poland's destruction was not marked by a battle, but by a signature. Joachim von Ribbentrop arrived to finalize the division of the country. He proposed a demarcation line on a map, slicing Poland in two. Stalin signed it with a blue wax pencil, a signature 10 inches long and nearly 2 inches thick. "Is my signature clear enough for you?" he asked. Ribbentrop smiled thinly. "Germans and Russians should never fight one another again." Stalin nodded. "This ought to be the case." The last Polish units surrendered in early October. Churchill summed it up with cold precision. "Russia has pursued a cold policy of self-interest. In exchange for 737 dead and 1,862 wounded, the Soviets claimed nearly half of Poland, 72,780 square miles to Germany's 77,600. They also seized a staggering quantity of arms: 900 artillery pieces, 1,000,000 shells, 10,000 machine guns, 300,000 rifles, 150 million rounds of ammunition, and 300 aircraft. But what they truly wanted was people, or more precisely, to erase those they couldn't control. Initial Polish casualty estimates sat at 18,000, but that figure would rise far higher in the years to come. When General Anders was driven east in a prison convoy, his escort told him flatly, "There will never be another Poland." The Soviets launched a campaign of extermination not only against Polish soldiers, but Polish society itself. An estimated 50,000 intellectuals, professionals, and community leaders were executed. Teachers, landowners, priests, doctors, judges, and business owners. Property was seized. Agriculture was forcibly collectivized. More than 1,000 banks and credit institutions were stripped and shut down. The economic system was gutted in months. Then came the deportations. Over 1.5 million people, Poles, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, were crammed into freight cars and sent east. There was no food, no water, no heat, only straw-covered floorboards and iron locks. A villager living near the tracks remembered lying awake at night, listening to the human cargo pass. The nights were unbearable, not just because of the rumble of the trains, but the cries. Adults, children, begging to be let out. They knocked on the walls with whatever they had, then silence, then more knocking. Thousands died before they reached the camps. Many more would die later, from starvation, exhaustion, frostbite, and disease. The lucky ones were worked to death. The rest were simply forgotten. Years later, in 1941, a Polish colonel who had escaped west asked aloud the question no one could answer. What are they doing now? Where are they? How many of them are still alive? There was no answer. Half of them would never be heard from again. Among the missing were 15,000 officers, including 12 generals and an admiral. They had surrendered under formal agreements. They had been promised humane treatment. They vanished without a trace. When General Władysław Anders, newly released from captivity and tasked with building a Polish army in exile, visited the Kremlin on December 3, 1941, he raised the issue directly with Stalin. Where were the men? The officers? The ones who never arrived? Stalin shrugged. That's impossible, he said. They must have escaped. Anders pressed him. Escaped where? Stalin paused. Well, to Manchuria. It was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it. The truth began to surface in 1943, when German troops discovered mass graves in the Katyn forest near Smolensk. Inside were the bodies of at least 4,134 Polish officers, each executed with a single bullet to the back of the head. The graves had been dug in secret, the victims shot one by one, their hands tied behind them. The Soviets denied responsibility for nearly half a century. Only in 1990, a full 51 years after the invasion, did the Russian government finally admit the truth. The NKVD had carried out the massacre. Katyn was not an accident. It was policy. At the time of the pact, Ribbentrop had told Stalin that their agreement, both the Public Non-Aggression Treaty and its secret protocol, was the foundation stone of the new friendly relations between Germany and the Soviet Union. But Churchill wasn't convinced. I still believed in the profound, and as I thought, unquenchable, antagonism between Russia and Germany, he said, and I clung to the hope that the Soviets would be drawn to our side by the force of events. That force of events would come 2 years later, on June 22, 1941, when Hitler tore up the agreement and launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. Ironically, Hitler had warned of this very scenario years earlier in the pages of Mein Kampf. The very fact of the conclusion of an alliance with Russia, he wrote, embodies a plan for the next war. Its outcome would be the end of Germany. He was right, but only too late to stop it. As for Poland, the country whose invasion had sparked the greatest war the world had ever seen, it would remain in Soviet hands for another 50 years. Not until 1989 did Poland finally break free. By October 1939, the Polish state had ceased to exist. Carved in half by Hitler and Stalin, its soldiers were either dead, captured, or exiled. And for the men who had survived the blitzkrieg, fled to France or Britain, or escaped to Hungary or Romania, a bitter question began to grow. What exactly had they been promised? Britain and France had declared war on Germany to defend Polish sovereignty. But when the Soviet Union invaded from the east, the silence from London was deafening. There was no declaration, no ultimatum, no action. And over the next 5 years, that silence would deepen, until, by 1945, the betrayal was complete. Churchill never declared war on the Soviet Union, and that decision, taken early and repeated often, would define the fate of Poland. From the beginning, Britain's guarantee to Poland had been political, not practical. It committed the British to defend Polish independence, but said nothing about how, and nothing about what to do if both Germany and the Soviet Union invaded. When Stalin crossed the Polish frontier on the 17th of September 1939, Britain had already declared war on Germany. It was facing naval warfare in the Atlantic, preparing for German air raids and mobilizing a small, underprepared expeditionary force in France. The idea of fighting the USSR, a second front in the east, was not just unthinkable, it was impossible. So Churchill made a decision. Hitler came first. That was the logic. Defeat Germany first, deal with Stalin later. The cost of that logic? Poland. In public, Churchill condemned the Soviet invasion, but in private, he moved on. In 1940, he took power as Prime Minister and began forging alliances to keep Britain in the war. When Hitler turned on Stalin in 1941 and launched Operation Barbarossa, Churchill saw his opportunity and took it. He welcomed the Soviet Union into the war as an ally. He sent weapons, ammunition, trucks, raw materials. Thousands of British soldiers sailed the deadly Arctic convoy routes to deliver supplies to Murmansk and Archangel, fighting ice, submarines, and Luftwaffe attacks to keep Stalin in the war. Churchill now had two allies, Roosevelt in the west, Stalin in the east, but not Poland. As the war turned, Polish exiles watched with growing dread. Their army in exile had fought in France, Norway, Tobruk, Monte Cassino, and the skies above Britain, yet their homeland was now being negotiated between London, Moscow, and Washington, with no seat at the table. In 1943, the Katyn massacre was revealed. Thousands of Polish officers found in mass graves, murdered by the Soviet NKVD. Churchill had proof, but to protect the alliance with Stalin, he stayed silent. The Polish government in exile was outraged, but they were told to keep quiet. Now is not the time, they were told. We must win the war first. In 1944, the betrayal became unmistakable. As the Red Army advanced into eastern Poland, it began establishing communist puppet regimes. Independent Polish fighters were arrested, disarmed, or executed when the Polish Home Army launched the Warsaw Uprising in August, hoping to liberate the capital before the Soviets arrived. Stalin ordered his forces to halt just across the Vistula River. They watched Warsaw burn. Churchill begged Stalin to assist the Poles. He ordered missions to drop weapons over the city, but it was too late. The Soviets delayed just long enough for the Germans to crush the uprising. Why didn't Britain intervene? Because by 1944, Churchill had accepted the truth. Stalin was going to control Eastern Europe. There would be no Western liberation of Poland, no D-Day landing on the Baltic. The Red Army would take what it wanted, and there was nothing Britain could do to stop it. At a meeting in Moscow in October 1944, Churchill sat across from Stalin and scribbled the percentages agreement on a scrap of paper. Romania, 90% Soviet. Bulgaria, 75% Soviet. Yugoslavia, 50-50. Greece, 90% British. And Poland, unwritten, unspoken, gone. He handed the slip to Stalin. Stalin ticked it with a blue pencil. Churchill later called it a sordid document, but never denied it. Poland was betrayed in 1939, when its allies defended it from one invader, but not the other. Poland was betrayed again in 1944, when its fighters were left to be destroyed, its government ignored, and its borders redrawn without consent. And in 1945, at Yalta, the betrayal was finalized. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to Soviet control of Poland in exchange for Stalin's promise of free elections. Those elections never came. Poland was absorbed into the Soviet sphere for the next 44 years. Churchill would later say, "The Soviet Union has become a danger to the free world." But by then, the war was over, the map was drawn, and Poland, the reason Britain had gone to war in the first place, was behind a new Iron Curtain, a wall built not just of concrete and barbed wire, but of silence.